Focus in the learning environment. This has become a really big issue in schools and distracted classrooms. In recent years, the diagnosis of ADD, attention deficit disorder, and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, have really increased significantly. In fact, it is currently the most prevalent childhood psychiatric diagnosis. And the co-authors of the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, which is the psychiatric manual that they use for coding different issues that people have said that they call it a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning it's not biological, it's developmental. Since you work in a preschool, you'll be seeing some of this, with a persistent behavioral pattern of severe inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity. They actually have called it an unreal epidemic. Just the number of kids, and it's not just kids, teenagers, adults have ADD and ADHD as well, but the number of kids that we're seeing with new diagnoses is really, really huge and concerning. This is one of those slides that you're always told, never make a slide that's just a huge number of text words. I put this up here. These are not even my words. They're from the Child Mind Institute, and it's a cut and paste from what they describe. But I wanted to share with you, for those of you who work with kids, or who have kids who are ADHD, or who have coworkers who are ADHD, the signs and symptoms that you can look for. Careless mistakes, easily distracted or sidetracked, has difficulty following instructions, doesn't seem to be listening, even when spoken to directly, trouble organizing tasks and possessions, trouble finishing schoolworks or chores, avoids taking on tasks that involve deep thinking or mental effort, or they lose their homework, or they lose their backpack, or they lose their shoes, or they lose their coat and leave it at school. These are some of the signs and symptoms that a child or an adult might need to get tested. This is the second half of their definition. More words. Child Mind Institute. They have great resources. This is the hyperactive or impulsivity side of ADHD. Here are some of the symptoms. Often fidgets or squirms, has trouble staying in their seat, runs or climbs when it's inappropriate, has trouble playing quietly, is extremely impatient, always seems on the go like a motor, talks excessively, blurts out answers without raising the hand or before the question's even completed, or interrupts or intrudes on other people's conversations. Now, having raised 3 kids, I will say a lot of these seem like just normal childhood behavior. It's a developmental issue, remember. The important thing to remember is that it's the intensity of this. That if somebody just has so many of these symptoms and it's so intense that they're really not able to focus, that's when a diagnosis is needed. In fact, the definition, you see that they group the symptoms into inattentive or hyperactive/impulsive, but the definition and the diagnosis requires extreme levels of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity in 2 different settings, usually home and school, that persists for at least 6 months. So it has to be a real issue that's impacting the quality of life for that individual and others around that individual. Okay? A population-based sample has looked at the prevalence of ADHD in the population. This is one of those other pieces of data that I sprinkled out on social media over the past couple weeks. So it turns out that previous population-based samples back to 1994. In 1994, researchers found a 3% prevalence rate. By 2007, it was up to 7%. So that's a long period of time during which it grew a little bit. What is the most recent prevalence in their most recent population-based sample from 2015? What would you guess? Any guesses? It is 15.5%. That's a steep incline. And that represents a large number of kids. More concerning for me is the fact of how many of these kids are medicated. And we'll talk about whether to medicate the kids or not in a little bit, a couple more slides, because that's a source of contention. That's hotly debated in these circles. But in 1995, 1.5 million kids were medicated due to ADHD, and now that's up to 3.5 million, maybe even more, because that's actually from 2011. So it's increased significantly. A couple more stats. 1 in 3 kids diagnosed as ADHD receives no support services in their school. More concerning, 1 in 5 receive no support services in their school, even when they're experiencing extreme, significant academic and social impairment. So even when they're really, really struggling, they're not getting the help that they need. 1 in 4 diagnosed with ADHD has repeated a grade, and 1 in 6 has been expelled for behavior problems. So this has serious long-term life consequences for kids or adults who are not able to focus. There is an enormously huge catalog of research and literature on ADD and ADHD. And that is actually not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is how to think better, feel better, do better. That's my tagline. That's what I do. So I help people release the stress and anxiety or focus more so that they don't display the symptoms of ADHD even when they have a diagnosis. You can learn to train your brain. However, there are a couple of important facts. A meta-analysis came out in 2017 that looked at the clinical research and compiled it for teachers, and for school and administrators. So I want to share those with you now. The first is that birth month matters. And what does that mean? Remember I said it's a developmental, they call it a disorder. I don't really care for that terminology. I'd rather think of them as neuroatypical because they have other huge benefits. They're very creative. They're very energetic. I mean, they have great skills that come along with that. And they just need to develop the skills that they need for focus so they can decide when to use which skill. But because it's a developmental issue, we have to make sure to distinguish between an actual diagnosis versus just relative immaturity. They found that kids who just squeaked by and just made it into that class due to their birth month and their age were twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than those who are the oldest ones in their class grade. Okay, so sometimes it's just that they need more time to develop. They're just more immature. Also, there's no single cause of ADHD that's been found through all the research. They have found that it's not biological, though, and there are no objective markers to be able to really identify who is ADHD. It's not like a blood test can tell them or anything else like a lot of other diagnoses. Most children with ADHD have normal brains. And I thought, that's a weird thing to even report. Where is this coming from? And I had to dig back and find, why is this being reported? Why is this important in the first place? Well, they used to think that kids with ADHD may have smaller sized brains. They found that to be untrue. They found that there's no correlation there, that a diagnosis of ADHD has no correlation to the size of the brain, and the size of the brain has no correlation to a diagnosis of ADHD. That's important for those of us who work with kids to know. Genetic origins of ADHD are overstated. Again, I thought, what do they mean by that? Why are they even reporting this piece of data? They used to think that it was hereditary, possibly, that adults who have ADHD would then have kids with ADHD. What they found is that in genetic studies that the genetic variation is less than 10% due to genetics, the variation in in what they're finding with the kids and their family members. Genetics accounts for less than 10% of that. Okay? Medication does not benefit most children in the long run. This is the one I said was hotly debated, right? You know, do you medicate or do you not medicate? On the one hand, the diagnosis opens the door for medication and for the help and support services that these kids need. So you go, oh, this diagnosis is a great thing. Now my child can get help. The medication part of it, what they found in initial studies is that there was an initial bump up in help from the medication. And they thought, ooh, medication is better than cognitive behavioral therapy at helping people with ADHD. This is the way to go. But once they did these studies longitudinally, meaning over time, they found that over time, the medication and cognitive behavioral therapy met. And that after about 8 years, there was shown to be no benefit of medication over just having normal therapy. It kind of makes sense since they found that it's a developmental disorder. You give those children more time to learn and mature, more time for their brains to grow, more time for them to learn tools and techniques for coping with what is more of a developmental behavioral issue. So other longitudinal studies actually found some adverse outcomes and negative outcomes as a result of medicating in the first place. So that is an individual decision that each parent is going to have to make on behalf of their children in conjunction with their doctor, possibly in conjunction with some feedback from school. But what they found is that over time, there is no benefit to medication. And a diagnosis can be harmful for children. As I was saying, the initial diagnosis, sometimes parents cheer. Okay, we have an explanation, we have a diagnosis, we have a reason, now we know what to do. We can either medicate or not medicate. And it gives us access to the support services in the school that we need. What other researchers have found, though, is that there are some possible detriments to the diagnosis. Parents and teachers can sometimes expect less of the children, okay, which tends to then become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, little Johnny's got ADHD. We've got to understand that he's just not going to do as well with that. Sometimes the child, him or herself, themselves, expect less of themselves, right? There's some self-actualization there. There's some prejudice and stigmatization, and there's some self-stigma and self-esteem issues. There's the decline in self-efficacy that I was mentioning. And there's a focus more on biological issues and like a fixed, well, this is just the way he or she is, versus on the behavioral issues that can be trained and changed and grow over time. There are the risk of overlooking other possible inputs into what the behavior is. And more concerning of all, what I found in some of the research is that some people diagnosed with ADD or ADHD later in life have problems getting disability and life insurance, which I never would have thought of that. That was new information to me. So there's a balance. You've got to figure out what's best for your own child or the children you're working with. But that's just to provide context. So knowing those 6 important facts is good context for figuring out what we're going to do regarding focus.